The polite electronic chime of the bank double doors cuts through the hushed, air-conditioned lobby of the Boise Financial Center. I sit in a leather chair near the commercial lending desks. My posture is perfectly aligned, my spine pressed flat against the rich upholstery. A thick manila folder rests on my lap. I do not fidget. I do not tap my foot against the polished marble floor. I simply watch the entrance. My older sister Valerie strides through the glass doors. She wears a tailored linen suit, the pale fabric catching the recessed lighting of the lobby. She projects the unearned authority of a woman who believes she has successfully executed a flawless theft. She moves with a crisp, practiced cadence, carrying a designer handbag like a shield of status. The scent of her expensive floral perfume reaches me before she does, covering the sterile scent of the financial institution. She scans the room and spots me. Her calculated stride falters for a fraction of a second. The rhythm breaks, but her narcissism quickly overrides her caution. Her lips curl into a sharp, victorious smirk. She assumes I am sitting in this lobby waiting to beg for a fraction of the inheritance. She alters her path, walking directly toward my chair, to deliver a public execution. "Leaving you out of the trust was the best decision Dad ever made," Valerie announces. She pitches her voice to ensure the tellers behind the security glass hear every syllable. "Taking control of the estate saved it from your mediocrity. You never had the stomach for real business." She stops 2 feet away from my chair. She expects me to flush with humiliation. She anticipates a frantic, tearful argument about our father's true wishes, or expects me to flee the lobby in shame. She wants the chaotic reaction that will validate the narrative she spent over a year meticulously constructing. I give her nothing. I do not break eye contact. I look at her tailored suit and her desperate, gleaming eyes. I offer a serene, impenetrable smile. "Is that what you believe?" Valerie, I ask. My voice is a flat, surgical baritone, devoid of any defensive heat or sorrow. I do not defend my intellect. I let the silence stretch, forcing her to hold the weight of her own arrogant perjury. Right as her smirk begins to falter, the heavy glass door of the manager's office opens. Mr. Caldwell steps out. He does not look like a man preparing to apologize for a delay. He looks like an executive arriving to finalize a hostile termination. "My name is Evelyn Hamilton. I am a 34-year-old corporate fraud investigator for the State Regulatory Board. If you have ever watched an entitled relative try to rewrite your reality while wearing a costume paid for with stolen equity, you are in the right place. Welcome back to Pana Vengeance. Drop your age and location in the comments, and be sure to subscribe." How did a fraud investigator let her sister steal her inheritance? She did not. She built the stage for the thief to stand on. To understand the trap currently closing around Valerie, we must jump back 14 months to the moment the root rot first revealed itself. 14 months before Valerie marched across that polished bank lobby, the air in northern Idaho carried the sharp, biting scent of pine needles and impending winter. The sky hung low over the mountains, the color of hammered iron. I stood at the window of my state regulatory office in Boise, watching a thin layer of frost creep across the reinforced glass. My name is Evelyn Hamilton. I am 34 years old, and I work as a corporate fraud investigator. My daily existence involves dismantling the glossy facades built by desperate people. I parse through convoluted tax discrepancies, identify structured laundering networks, and track the digital paper trails of corrupt executives attempting to hide their insolvency. I do not deal in polite assumptions or whispered family gossip. I deal in verifiable ledgers and time-stamped receipts. My analytical nature was not forged in a government cubicle. It was cultivated in the deep, sprawling forests of the Pacific Northwest. My father, Richard, owned a lucrative portfolio of commercial timberland. It was a quiet, expansive empire of Douglas fir and ponderosa pine. When I was a child, long before his health failed or the trust disputes began, he used to walk those timber tracts with me. I remember the crunch of dry needles under our boots and the damp, earthy smell of the soil. During one of those hikes, he stopped and placed his calloused hand against the trunk of a towering, seemingly flawless pine. He instructed me to knock on the wood. I curled my fist and struck the bark. The sound echoed hollow. He taught me the concept of root rot that afternoon. He explained how a tree can look vibrant, boasting green needles and a thick, sturdy exterior, while a fungal infection quietly hollows out the core. The decay starts underground, invisible to the casual observer, until a single strong wind snaps the trunk in half. It was a lesson about botany, but it became the defining metaphor for my family. My older sister Valerie possessed the exact characteristics of an infected pine. She ran a boutique public relations firm in downtown Boise. Her entire professional life centered around crafting impeccable exteriors and hiding structural flaws. She wore tailored cashmere, leased premium European sedans, and spoke with the breathless, manufactured urgency of a woman orchestrating highly important events. But beneath the designer polish, the foundation was always hollow. When our father's health began a steep, irreversible decline, Valerie did not view his physical vulnerability as a looming tragedy. She viewed it as a prime acquisition opportunity. The campaign to erase me from the family narrative did not begin with a loud theatrical declaration. It started with pebbles, small, deniable slights, designed to test the perimeter of my patience and establish her authority over his care. As his mobility waned, he required admission to an upscale rehabilitation clinic. Valerie immediately volunteered to manage his schedule, claiming her public relations background made her uniquely suited to handle the administrative burden. I allowed her to coordinate the logistics, preferring to focus on reviewing his medical charts and consulting with his attending physicians. My compliance granted her the operational space she needed to begin the exclusion. The friction manifested on a crisp Tuesday afternoon. I left my state office during a lunch break to deliver a fresh set of clothes to his recovery suite. I approached the reception desk of the rehabilitation center holding my state identification badge. The clerk typed my name into the facility database. She frowned, tapping the screen a second time. She looked up with a polite, apologetic wince and informed me that my name was absent from the approved visitor registry. She explained that Valerie had updated the security protocols that morning, explicitly restricting access to a curated list of associates. My own sister had administratively barred me from seeing my father. The average person would escalate the situation. They would demand a supervisor raise their pitch and cause a scene in the quiet lobby. They would provide Valerie with the exact chaotic reaction she desired. If I argued with the clerk, Valerie would inevitably hear about the disruption. She would use the incident to paint me as an erratic, disruptive element, causing undue stress in a healing environment. I refused to supply the ammunition. I did not raise my voice. I smiled at the clerk, thanked her for her diligence in maintaining facility security, and left the clothes with the front desk. I walked back to my car, the cold Idaho wind biting at my coat. I recognized the tactic. It was a perimeter test. She was probing the fences, checking to see if I would fight back or swallow the insult. I bypassed her administrative blockade the following morning by arriving at dawn long before the reception desk enforced the formal visitor hours. I sat in the vinyl chair beside my father's bed, holding his resting hand. He was asleep, the rhythmic hiss of the oxygen concentrator filling the quiet room. An hour later, the heavy wooden door swung open. Valerie marched in, holding a boutique coffee cup and carrying a sprawling, oversized leather tote bag. She stopped short when she saw me sitting in the corner. A flicker of profound irritation crossed her features, but she quickly masked it with a tight, artificial smile. She claimed she was just dropping by to handle some tedious insurance paperwork. She set her coffee down and began rummaging through the deep compartments of her designer tote. She pushed aside expensive cosmetic compacts, glossy promotional brochures, and a ring of keys. As she shifted the contents, the interior hospital light caught a specific, dense object resting at the bottom of the bag. It was a heavy black, self-inking notary stamp. The visual data point registered in my mind with sharp, clinical clarity. An executive running a public relations boutique has zero legitimate daily use for a physical state notary seal. It is a specialized legal tool, not a marketing accessory. You do not carry a notary stamp to a client luncheon unless you are planning to execute a binding contract outside the purview of a certified professional. I did not ask her why she was carrying the device. I did not point it out. I simply filed the observation away in the secure mental vault where I store irregular audit findings. I watched her retrieve a stack of insurance claim forms, snap her bag shut, and adopt the weary posture of a burdened caretaker. I let her weave her fragile fiction. I listened to her complain about the arduous task of managing the estate details, while I supposedly hid in my dreary government cubicle. I offered a serene, impenetrable nod. Defending your intellect or your devotion to a narcissist is a strategic failure. It only grants them the friction they crave to sustain their victim narrative. I knew that allowing her to feel victorious in these minor social skirmishes would make her complacent. A confident thief is a careless thief. I sat in that hospital room, watching the fungal rot consume the core of my family tree. I absorbed the deniable slights, knowing the pebbles were merely the precursor to a much larger avalanche. The subtle exclusions at the clinic were about to evolve into a devastating structural threat. My father's failing heart was keeping the true danger at bay, but the moment his chest stopped rising, Valerie was prepared to drop the polite facade. She was carrying the tools of her treason in her designer handbag, waiting for the funeral dirge to signal the start of her hostile takeover. The transition from the solemn silence of the cemetery to the cold arithmetic of a boardroom took exactly 7 days. Grief is a biological process that demands time, but estate execution is a strict legal timeline that waits for no one. We convened on a Tuesday morning inside the downtown Boise offices of my late father's estate attorney. The conference room smelled of sharp lemon polish, aged leather binders, and stale coffee. The autumn rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, blurring the Idaho City skyline into a wash of impenetrable gray. I took a seat near the center of the heavy mahogany table. I wore a simple charcoal suit, carrying a standard yellow legal pad and a silver pen. Valerie arrived 15 minutes late. It was a deliberate, calculated delay, engineered to ensure the room was waiting in suspended anticipation for her arrival. She swept through the double doors wearing a tailored black sheath dress that looked far more appropriate for a high society gala than a somber legal proceeding. Her husband, Bryce, trailed a half step behind her. He wore a custom pinstripe suit and a platinum watch, projecting the unearned confidence of a man preparing to cash a lottery ticket he did not purchase. Bryce possessed the smooth, frictionless exterior of an individual who traded exclusively on his wife's lineage. He did not build wealth. He attached himself to the people who did. He pulled out a chair for my sister, his posture radiating a smug, eager energy. He surveyed the polished conference room with hungry eyes, already mentally liquidating the assets he believed he was about to inherit. The estate attorney, a weary, meticulous man named Harrison who had managed my father's affairs for 2 decades, opened the primary ledger. For years, the foundational architecture of the trust had been unambiguous. The commercial timberland portfolio was divided into an even 50-50 split between the 2 daughters. It was a logical, equitable distribution, reflecting the deep, sustaining roots of the forest itself. Harrison cleared his throat, adjusting his reading glasses, to commence the formal review. Valerie did not allow him to finish his opening sentence. She reached into her designer tote bag, the exact same oversized leather purse she had carried into the rehabilitation clinic weeks prior, and extracted a sleek plastic folder. She placed it onto the table with a sharp, definitive slap. The sound echoed off the wood paneling. She announced that the primary trust documents Harrison held were outdated. She claimed my father had executed a final binding amendment during his last week in hospice care. She slid a few stapled pages out of the folder and pushed them toward the center of the wood. The attorney frowned, his professional equilibrium disturbed by the sudden introduction of unsanctioned paperwork. He reached for the document. I did not frown. I leaned forward, my eyes tracking the text before Harrison could even begin to process the betrayal. The document was a typed addendum. It contained sweeping, draconian clauses that revoked all prior stipulations of the established trust. It designated Valerie as the sole executor and the exclusive beneficiary of the entire commercial timberland portfolio. It effectively erased me from my own family lineage with a few paragraphs of dense legal jargon. I looked at the date stamped near the top margin. It coincided perfectly with the final days of my father's life, a period when his pain management protocol involved heavy, continuous doses of intravenous morphine. He lacked the cognitive capacity to identify his own surroundings, let alone authorize the complex restructuring of a multi-million-dollar enterprise. I shifted my focus to the bottom of the page. The signature was a shaky, erratic scrawl that barely resembled his robust, familiar handwriting. It looked like the script of a man whose hand was being guided by an external force. And resting right beside that questionable ink was the circular black seal of a state notary. The image of that black seal triggered a specific chronological recall. I visualized the hospital room. I saw the oversized designer tote bag. I saw the heavy self-inking tool resting near her cosmetic compacts. The timeline of the forgery assembled itself in my mind with pristine clarity. She had not brought a legitimate independent state official to his bedside to verify his capacity. She had utilized a stolen seal. Valerie did not wait for Harrison to verify the legal standing of the document. She immediately launched into a rehearsed, breathless monologue. She utilized her public relations training to spin the hostile takeover into a tragic, sentimental blessing. She placed a hand over her chest, her voice trembling with fabricated sorrow. She claimed Dad realized in his final hours that the timberland required a steward with true business acumen. She told the room that he wanted the portfolio managed by an executive who understood corporate growth rather than a civil servant trapped in a dreary government cubicle. She framed the theft as a heavy burden she was bravely accepting to honor a dying man's final wish. She was painting herself as the reluctant savior of the family legacy, insulating her greed with a veneer of tragic responsibility. Bryce nodded in solemn agreement, attempting to look dignified, while his eyes gleamed with raw, unfiltered greed. He leaned over the table and slid a secondary piece of paper directly in front of my legal pad. It was a formal waiver of contest. Valerie adopted a tone of practical sisterly concern. She suggested that dragging the estate through the probate courts would be a tedious, draining ordeal for everyone involved. She insisted that signing the waiver would save us both exorbitant legal fees and preserve the dignity of our father's memory. She wanted me to voluntarily relinquish my right to challenge the forged amendment. She was attempting to secure my surrender before the ink on her crime even had time to settle. She expected me to sign it. She assumed my quiet, observant nature was a symptom of inherent weakness. She calculated that the shock of the sudden disinheritance, combined with the intimidating environment of the law office and the presence of her looming husband, would force my compliance. I looked at the waiver. I looked at the forged signature on the amendment. I picked up my silver pen, but I did not direct it toward the dotted line. I tapped the metal clip once against the mahogany table. The sharp click sliced through the lingering echo of her performance. "I decline," I stated. My voice was a flat, surgical baritone. It carried zero defensive heat and offered no room for negotiation. I do not sign unsolicited legal waivers regarding unverifiable documents. The polite, manufactured sorrow vanished from Valerie's face in a fraction of a second. The public relations mask shattered, revealing the desperate, vindictive operative underneath. Her eyes narrowed into cold, hostile slits. Her posture went rigid, the tension snapping through her spine. The illusion of sisterly concern evaporated, replaced by the raw malice she usually kept hidden from the public eye. "If you try to fight this, Evelyn," Valerie hissed, her voice dropping into a harsh, threatening register, "I will drag your name through the mud. I will tie this estate up in litigation for the next decade. I will ensure every dollar of that trust is burned on defense attorneys before you ever see a single cent." Bryce stepped closer to her chair, folding his arms across his chest in a crude display of physical intimidation. He offered a dark, warning glare, attempting to add muscular weight to his wife's verbal assault. "I will ruin your pristine little government career," Valerie continued, leaning forward over the table. "I will paint you to everyone in this city as a greedy, estranged daughter harassing her grieving family for a handout. You will walk away with nothing but a ruined reputation. Sign the paper." She delivered the ultimatum with the supreme confidence of a predator holding the high ground. She had secured the structural leverage through the fraudulent document. She had Bryce standing behind her as a silent enforcer. She believed she had cornered me in a room where facts mattered less than volume. I did not flinch away from her leaning posture. I did not offer a defensive rebuttal regarding my father's true intentions. I maintained a serene, impenetrable stare. Let her believe the threat was effective. Let her assume my silence was a manifestation of defeat. In the realm of fraud investigation, when the target issues a threat based on a fabricated ledger, you do not interrupt them. You let them commit to the lie. You allow them to march forward, entirely unaware they are walking onto a fragile surface. Mallory thought she had won the war in that conference room. She believed her sudden escalation had neutralized the threat I posed to her newly acquired empire. She did not realize she had simply fired the starting pistol, and her next maneuver would provide the exact public stage I needed to document her impending ruin. The battle was shifting from the quiet confines of the legal office to a highly visible arena, and she was eager to take the first shot. When you deny a narcissist their immediate private victory, they will invariably seek a public tribunal. They require an audience to validate their fiction and apply the social pressure they could not generate in isolation. Valerie had failed to secure my signature in the mahogany conference room. She had failed to intimidate me into a quiet, impoverished exile. Her response was predictable, calculating, and engineered for maximum visibility. She moved the theater of war from the sterile environment of a law office to the manicured, exclusive terraces of the Hillcrest Country Club. The invitation arrived precisely 2 weeks after the reading of the forged amendment. It was printed on heavy cream-colored cardstock, featuring an elegant, embossed border. The text invited me to a memorial luncheon celebrating the life and legacy of our late father, Richard Hamilton. It was a staggering display of audacity. Valerie was hosting a gathering funded entirely by the Timberland Trust she had just hijacked, utilizing stolen capital to finance her own coronation. I understood the strategic imperative of attendance. In the realm of high society disputes, absence is always interpreted as an admission of guilt. If I declined the invitation, Valerie would stand before her curated audience and sigh mournfully about my inability to face the family. She would claim my non-attendance was proof of my supposed greed and lingering resentment. I had to walk into the lion's den. I had to occupy a seat at the table to prevent her from controlling the narrative unchallenged. The Hillcrest Country Club possessed the kind of manufactured perfection that requires immense invisible labor. The sprawling grounds featured pristine golf courses, towering oaks, and a grand clubhouse designed to project generational stability. I handed the keys of my practical sedan to a valet stationed beneath the sweeping portico. He glanced at my vehicle, a stark contrast to the imported luxury SUVs populating the circular driveway, but his professional demeanor remained intact. I stepped onto the polished stone pathway, adjusting the lapels of my dark-tailored blazer. The air smelled of chlorine, expensive jasmine perfume, and freshly cut grass. I navigated the grand lobby, bypassing the ornate floral arrangements, and located the private dining terrace reserved for the Hamilton Memorial Luncheon. The space overlooked the 18th hole, offering a panoramic view of the rolling hills. Round tables draped in crisp white linen dotted the patio. The guest list was extensive, featuring affluent neighbors, local politicians, and the wives of influential executives. These were the arbiters of Boise society. They controlled the charity boards and dictated the whisper networks. Valerie had not gathered them to mourn our father. She had assembled a jury. Valerie held court at the absolute center of the terrace. She wore a sophisticated, muted gray silk dress, projecting the aura of a weary but resolute matriarch. Rice hovered nearby holding a crystal glass of bourbon, offering solemn nods to the arriving guests. His posture radiated the unearned satisfaction of a man who believed he had just inherited an empire. I approached the gathering with my spine perfectly aligned. I did not shrink from the collective gaze of the attendees. Valerie spotted me. Her eyes narrowed for a microscopic fraction of a second before her face melted into a mask of exaggerated, tragic relief. "Evelyn, darling," she called out. Her voice was pitched loud enough to capture the attention of the surrounding tables. It carried a breathy, fluttering quality designed to convey deep maternal sorrow. "I am so glad you found the time to join us. I know how consumed you are with your government duties." I took the only empty chair left at her designated table. It was positioned directly opposite my sister, placing me squarely in the crosshairs of her performance. I ordered a glass of iced tea from the hovering waiter. I did not touch the imported wine chilling in the silver bucket nearby. You do not consume alcohol when you are walking into a hostile deposition. The opening course arrived. Plates of delicate pastries and seasonal fruit were distributed. Valerie initiated her primary offensive with the precision of a seasoned stage actor. She sighed heavily, resting her manicured hands on the white tablecloth. The affluent wives leaned forward instinctively, drawn to the scent of domestic vulnerability. "It is just so incredibly difficult to balance everything lately," Valerie murmured, tracing the rim of her water glass. "Managing the intricacies of Dad's estate is a monumental undertaking. The sheer volume of the liquid assets, the commercial timber contracts, the operational overhead. It is a heavy burden to carry alone." She paused, allowing the fabricated magnitude of her wealth to settle over the listeners. She was projecting the image of a reluctant titan, forced to shoulder the crushing weight of a multi-million-dollar portfolio. Then she shifted her gaze across the floral centerpiece, locking eyes with me. The manufactured pride dissolved, replaced by a toxic, suffocating pity. "It breaks my heart that some members of our family cannot share in this legacy." Valerie continued, her tone dripping with quiet devastation. "Evelyn has always been so fiercely independent. She harbors such a deep resentment toward the complexities of the corporate world. I suppose spending all those hours tracking minor discrepancies in a dreary cubicle has made her bitter toward true business acumen." The wives turned their collective attention in my direction. The polite warmth they usually displayed vanished. Their expressions hardened into a unified wall of judgment. They looked at my practical attire and my unstyled hair. They silently convicted me of petty sibling jealousy. Valerie was painting me as a hostile anomaly, a woman so consumed by her own lack of ambition that she actively attempted to sabotage her father's final wishes. She was constructing a vital alibi. By labeling me as an unsupportive, greedy sister, Valerie was providing the country club network with a convenient explanation for why I was entirely excluded from the trust. She needed to preemptively discredit any truth I might speak in the future. If I ever revealed the forged amendment or the expired notary stamp, these women would simply dismiss my words as the paranoid ramblings of a spiteful relative denied a handout. But establishing my villainy was only the first phase of her strategy. She needed to establish my financial desperation to complete the portrait. Valerie leaned forward, tilting her head, observing my dark blazer with a look of profound sorrow. "Evelyn, sweetheart," she purred, her voice carrying a lethal edge disguised as familial concern. "I know you are struggling. Civil service wages only stretch so far, and living in that modest little apartment must feel so confining. You do not have to put up this brave front for us. We are your family." The air on the terrace stood completely still. The trap was laid bare under the bright Idaho sun. "I want to help you," Valerie announced, ensuring the surrounding tables could hear her benevolence. "I want to cover your rent this month. Let me ease your burden. I cannot bear the thought of you facing eviction because you cannot afford your basic living expenses. Please, let me do this for you." The sheer audacity of the maneuver was breathtaking. She was attempting to rewrite my immaculate financial reality. I possessed a pristine credit rating and a zero debt history. I managed my expenses with the disciplined precision of an auditor. Yet here she sat, using stolen equity to buy luncheon pastries while publicly offering me charity to paint me as a destitute failure. She wanted a reaction. She craved a public meltdown. She expected me to flush red with humiliation. She anticipated a shouted defense of my bank accounts or a frantic demand for respect. If I threw my iced tea in her face or stormed off the patio, she would win. She would turn to her friends, shake her head, and validate the exact narrative of instability she had just spun. I did not grip the edge of the table. I did not let my breathing shallow. I maintained a relaxed, open posture. I met the collective judgment of the affluent wives with serene indifference. I drew upon the intense discipline required to manage a corporate fraud investigation. When a corrupt executive attempts to intimidate you during an audit, you do not panic. You assess the data. Valerie's data indicated severe desperation. I smiled. It was a warm, bright, impenetrable expression that offered absolutely no friction. "That is incredibly generous of you, Valerie," I replied, my voice projecting clearly across the terrace. It carried no anger and zero defensive tremor. "But my finances are in pristine order. My living arrangements serve my needs perfectly. You should keep your capital accessible. Managing such vast liquid assets requires significant liquidity, and you might need those funds much sooner than I will." I watched the color drain from Valerie's face. The casual mention of her required liquidity struck a hidden nerve. She knew I possessed the analytical tools to dissect a balance sheet. The affluent wives looked confused by the sudden shift in the atmospheric pressure. The seed of my supposed desperation had been planted, but the harvest was ruined by my refusal to water it with my anger. I did not give them the satisfying climax of a family dispute. I simply agreed with the premise of her generosity, while quietly reminding her of the impending financial complexities she was attempting to manage. I took a slow sip of my iced tea. The dramatic irony hummed in my chest, a steady, satisfying vibration. Valerie was boasting about a Timberland portfolio she had acquired through a fraudulent, expired notary stamp. She was funding a smear campaign using stolen capital. I let her weave her fragile web. I sat at the table and allowed her to document her own cruelty, aware that every false word she spoke in public today would make the eventual drop of the forensic hammer far more devastating tomorrow. I excused myself politely before the main course arrived, leaving my sister to stew in her own unfulfilled malice. I walked back to my practical sedan and drove away from the wrought iron gates. The social smear campaign was fully operational. They were closing the net from the outside in. But their entire strategy relied on the assumption that the stolen Timberland Trust was secure. They believed the only threat to their empire was my stubborn refusal to comply with their narrative. They were entirely ignorant of the quiet read-only monitor I had established on the county property tax portals. I did not realize how close they were to the edge until 3 months later, when a sudden digital flag revealed a secret far more dangerous than a forged signature. The true nature of my sister's hostility was hiding inside an untraceable offshore wire transfer. The harsh Idaho winter arrived 3 months after the memorial luncheon at the country club. Heavy snow blanketed the Treasure Valley, burying the sprawling commercial timberland my father had spent his lifetime cultivating. The deep freeze settled over the state, and a similar chilling silence settled over my family dynamic. Valerie believed she had secured an unconditional victory. She assumed my serene departure from the country club terrace was a silent, formal surrender. In her curated reality, the working-class sister had retreated to her dreary government cubicle, accepting her disinheritance and leaving the wealthy matriarch to govern the newly acquired empire in peace. She continued her social campaign unchallenged, throwing lavish holiday parties and treating the trust fund as her own sovereign treasury. She believed the war was over. She did not comprehend that an auditor never abandons a compromised ledger. We merely step back from the visible battlefield to establish a secure perimeter. The most critical phase of a corporate fraud investigation does not occur during the initial confrontation. It occurs during the quiet, monotonous hours of remote observation. Before you can drop a forensic hammer, you must allow the target to construct the entire architecture of their crime. You must give them the rope and watch them tie the knot. I utilized my professional clearance to establish a digital tripwire. Commercial timberland of that magnitude carries a severe property tax liability. Those liabilities are managed through specialized county escrow portals. While Valerie possessed the forged legal authority to control the primary bank accounts, she could not hide the overarching municipal tax registries. I bypassed the private financial institutions entirely and placed a quiet read-only monitor on the county tax interfaces associated with every parcel of land in my father's portfolio. I programmed the system to alert me to any structural shifts in the recorded equity. I did not need to see her daily spending habits. I needed to see if she attempted to leverage the foundation. For 3 months, the interface remained dormant. The winter wind rattled the windows of my apartment, but my digital monitors displayed nothing but routine administrative maintenance. I began to wonder if Valerie was simply content to siphon the liquid cash reserves, leaving the physical timberland untouched. The waiting required immense discipline. The urge to pry open the doors and demand an accounting of my father's legacy hummed in the back of my mind. I suppressed the instinct, relying on the cold, tactical patience forged in the state regulatory board. The silence shattered on a Tuesday evening in late January. I was sitting at my home office desk reviewing standard tax discrepancies for a regional manufacturing firm. The ambient light in the room was low, casting long shadows across the floorboards. A sharp digital notification chimed from my secondary monitor. It was a high-priority alert generated by the county escrow tracker. I set my pen down. The rhythmic ticking of the wall clock seemed to amplify, filling the quiet space of my apartment. I shifted my chair and engaged the secondary screen. A severe structural extraction was underway. The county portal registered a sequence of drafts pulling equity directly against the primary holding account of the Timberland Trust. I stared at the numerical values populating the interface. If Valerie had simply authorized a single 6-figure withdrawal to purchase a luxury vehicle or fund an extravagant vacation, I would have recognized standard, ignorant greed. A single large draft is a clumsy, careless maneuver that leaves a glaring footprint. The numbers glowing on my screen were not clumsy. They were terrifyingly precise. The interface displayed a sequence of 4 separate drafts executed over a period of 48 hours. The first withdrawal was for $9,500. The second withdrawal, executed 12 hours later, was for $9,600. The third and fourth drafts mirrored the pattern, remaining fixed just below the $10,000 mark. The total extraction hovered near $40,000, but the specific division of the capital triggered an immediate, involuntary physiological response. A cold, clinical dread pooled in my stomach, dropping my internal temperature. My hands hovered over the keyboard, paralyzed by the implications of the data. In the realm of financial compliance, that specific numerical pattern is not a coincidence. It is a highly deliberate criminal tactic known as smurfing. The federal government enforces strict anti-money laundering regulations under the Bank Secrecy Act. Any domestic financial transaction exceeding $10,000 automatically generates a currency transaction report. The report alerts the Internal Revenue Service and triggers a mandatory institutional review. Criminal syndicates, drug cartels, and corporate embezzlers circumvent this security measure by structuring their withdrawals. They break a large sum of dirty capital into smaller, inconspicuous increments, keeping every single draft just below the $10,000 reporting threshold. They slip under the automated radar, washing the funds through the system without sounding the alarm. Valerie was not a criminal mastermind. She ran a public relations boutique. She possessed zero practical knowledge of federal banking loopholes or structured laundering mechanics. She spent her days managing aesthetic marketing campaigns, not navigating complex financial evasion protocols. The presence of a sophisticated smurfing operation indicated a secondary influence. It pointed toward an operator who thrived on high-risk manipulation and possessed a profound, arrogant disregard for institutional boundaries. The identity of the architect materialized in my mind with pristine, horrifying clarity. Bryce. I pictured my brother-in-law standing in the mahogany conference room, radiating the unearned confidence of a man eager to spend money he did not earn. Bryce was a man who traded entirely on volatile trends. He possessed no tangible skills and built no actual products. He spent family dinners holding a glass of expensive scotch, boasting loudly about his high-risk cryptocurrency investments. He treated decentralized finance like a limitless casino, treating volatile offshore exchanges as his personal playground. He viewed traditional banking as an archaic inconvenience. The puzzle pieces locked together, forming a grim, catastrophic picture. Valerie had secured the trust using the forged amendment, but Bryce was managing the extraction. I assumed the worst possible scenario. I hypothesized that Bryce, recognizing the vast, unencumbered equity of the timberland, had convinced Valerie to let him multiply their newly acquired fortune. He was structuring the withdrawals to bypass the domestic reporting thresholds, preparing to route the stolen capital into unregulated offshore cryptocurrency wallets. The sheer magnitude of the threat paralyzed my lungs. Cryptocurrency operating on decentralized offshore exchanges is a digital ghost. Once fiat currency is converted into untraceable tokens and transferred across international borders into anonymous wallets, it effectively vanishes from the jurisdiction of the United States legal system. Recovering stolen assets from a decentralized blockchain is a logistical nightmare bordering on impossible. My father had spent his entire life nurturing that timberland. He knew the soil. He knew the growth cycles of the pines. He had built a legacy rooted in the physical earth. Now that legacy was being digitized and vaporized by an arrogant gambler. Bryce was taking the deep roots of our family and feeding them into a volatile digital casino. If the market crashed, the entire estate would burn to ash in a fraction of a second. For 15 agonizing minutes, I sat frozen in my ergonomic chair. The blue light of the monitor washed over my face, highlighting the stark, undeniable reality of the ledger. I listened to the winter wind howling against the glass pane of my window. A profound, suffocating panic seized my chest. I genuinely feared the empire was already gone. I assumed Bryce had been running this smurfing operation in the dark for weeks, siphoning the equity drop by drop and throwing it into the digital ether. I braced for the heartbreaking conclusion that my patient, tactical waiting had cost me everything. I feared I was too late to apply the tourniquet. The urge to pick up my phone and scream at my sister surged upward. The primal instinct demanded that I call Valerie, confront her about her husband's reckless gambling, and demand the immediate return of the remaining funds. I wanted to threaten them with the authorities and drag their actions into the light. I forced the urge down. I swallowed the emotional devastation and allowed the cold, iron discipline of my profession to override my terror. An auditor does not act on a hypothesis. An auditor does not initiate a confrontation based on a partial ledger. A structured withdrawal is a symptom, but it is not a destination. Before I could tear down their kingdom, I needed to find the vault where they were storing the stolen bricks. If Bryce was routing the money to an offshore exchange, the metadata attached to the electronic drafts would reveal the digital handshake. Every wire transfer leaves a routing footprint. I needed to bypass the surface-level county tax portal and initiate a deep forensic trace on the specific receiving accounts. I moved my hands back to the keyboard. I closed the alert window and opened a secure, encrypted terminal. I prepared to pull the digital thread, expecting to find a labyrinth of international shell companies and anonymous crypto wallets. I was bracing for a global chase. I did not realize the true destination of the stolen capital was hiding right in my own backyard, and the reality of the destination would fundamentally alter the entire landscape of the war. I stared at the encrypted terminal on my monitor and forced my respiratory rate to slow. The primal human instinct when faced with a perceived threat is to attack the shadow. My initial deduction pointed toward my brother-in-law, Bryce, and his loud, arrogant boasting about unregulated offshore cryptocurrency exchanges. The structured withdrawals, the smurfing pattern of $9,500 per transaction, fit the profile of a man trying to bypass federal reporting thresholds to gamble in the digital ether. If I were an amateur, I would have picked up my phone, called my sister, and demanded she confront her husband about his volatile investments. I would have triggered a chaotic domestic argument based entirely on an unverified hypothesis. But I am a forensic investigator. I do not act on assumptions, and I refuse to confront a target without empirical data. A numerical pattern is merely a symptom. The routing node is the actual disease. I needed to isolate the destination of the capital before I engaged the enemy. I bypassed the surface-level county property portals and initiated a deep dive into the metadata of the structured wire transfers. Tracing electronic drafts requires patience and a specific tolerance for digital labyrinthine structures. Financial institutions utilize complex routing protocols to move equity. I pulled the specific data packets associated with the latest withdrawal. I initiated a secure tracing algorithm designed to follow the electronic handshake between the originating trust account and the receiving bank. I watched the lines of code populate my screen, tracking the path of the stolen funds. I expected the geographical coordinates to jump across international borders. I braced myself to see the server location resolve to a decentralized exchange platform in the Caribbean or Eastern Europe. The data resolved on my screen, but the coordinates did not point toward a foreign registry. The connection had bounced through a regional clearinghouse and terminated at a commercial banking branch located less than 4 miles from my own apartment in downtown Boise. The money was not heading offshore. It was moving locally. I isolated the account holder information attached to the receiving routing number. The text glowed stark and white against the dark interface of my monitor. The receiving entity was not an anonymous crypto wallet. It was a domestic limited liability company registered under the name Vanguard Public Relations. The realization shifted the entire landscape of the conflict with breathtaking velocity. Bryce was not gambling the money. The loud, arrogant brother-in-law holding a glass of bourbon and talking about digital tokens at family dinners was nothing but a convenient, noisy distraction. He was a smokescreen. The architect of the structured laundering mechanism was my own sister. Valerie was utilizing the complex smurfing technique to wash the stolen timberland equity, funneling it directly into the operating accounts of her own boutique firm. The relief that the legacy was not vaporizing into a decentralized casino was instantly eclipsed by a far more intimate horror. I pivoted my investigation away from the estate trust and directed my full analytical focus onto the public relations firm itself. If an executive is siphoning tens of thousands of dollars into their primary business account in structured increments, they are not executing a growth strategy. They are applying a tourniquet. I accessed the state corporate registry and pulled the public financial disclosures, uniform commercial code filings, and commercial credit reports associated with Vanguard Public Relations. The ledger revealed a staggering, breathtaking theft. Valerie projected the image of a savvy, elite business owner. She wore tailored linen suits, drove a leased premium European sedan, and hosted extravagant luncheons at the local country club. She sold her clients on her impeccable taste and her effortless success. But the financial documents painted a portrait of a woman suffocating under the weight of her own curated vanity. Her boutique firm was functionally insolvent. The business was drowning in toxic debt. She had defaulted on her premium downtown office lease. Her vendors were filing liens for unpaid retainer fees. Her corporate credit cards were maxed out to their absolute limits, bearing predatory interest rates that compounded daily. The pristine, polished exterior of her life was a fabrication maintained solely by the rapid injection of stolen capital. The lesson my father taught me in the sprawling Idaho timberlands echoed in the quiet space of my home office. Root rot. I remembered the hollow sound of my fist knocking against the bark of an infected pine tree. Valerie was the infected pine. She looked vibrant and healthy on the surface, commanding the bank lobby and dictating the terms of our family hierarchy. But a fungal decay had consumed her core. The root rot was terminal. She had not forged the estate amendment out of simple greed. She had executed the hostile takeover out of imminent financial ruin. She was siphoning our father's legacy, drop by drop, just to keep the lights on in her office and the leased keys in her purse. But a forensic audit requires peeling back every layer of the ledger, and the deeper I dug into her corporate filings, the more devastating the truth became. I examined a specific Uniform Commercial Code filing registered 6 months prior. It was a notice of a secured commercial loan issued by a secondary lending institution. Valerie had procured a substantial influx of capital to temporarily stave off her creditors long before the smurfing operation began. To secure a loan of that magnitude, a bank requires tangible, unencumbered collateral. A failing public relations firm possesses 0 tangible assets. I pulled the collateral schedule attached to the loan origination documents. I read the parcel identification numbers listed on the addendum. My breath caught in my throat. The collateral securing her toxic commercial debt was the commercial timberland portfolio. The twist cut deeper than a simple post-mortem embezzlement. I looked at the date stamped on the loan origination paperwork. The timeline was irrefutable. The loan was executed and the timberland was leveraged 3 months before our father passed away. 3 months before he entered the hospice facility. Valerie did not just wait for him to die to steal the trust. She utilized the trust as collateral while he was still alive, undergoing rehabilitation, and trusting her to manage his schedule. She had forged his authorization, manipulated the ownership documents, and submitted them to a commercial lender to secure a bailout for her boutique. She had committed federal bank fraud. The sheer audacity of the crime paralyzed my hands over the keyboard. My father had spent his entire life nurturing those trees. He knew the soil acidity, the growth cycles of the Douglas firs, and the subtle shifts in the ecosystem. He had built a sustaining physical legacy meant to provide security for generations. Valerie looked at that lifetime of labor and saw nothing but numbers on a balance sheet waiting to be liquidated. She sacrificed the deep roots of our family to fund a superficial aesthetic. She risked federal prison to ensure the women at the country club continued to view her as a wealthy matriarch. The scale of her treason demanded a proportional response. I could not simply present these findings in a civil probate court. A civil dispute would allow her to drag the litigation out for years, draining whatever equity remained to pay her defense attorneys. This was no longer a family dispute over an inheritance. This was a federal criminal enterprise. I needed to move the war underground. I needed to compile an airtight, irrefutable paper trail that no high-priced defense lawyer could unravel. Digital metadata and routing logs are compelling, but prosecutors require physical, undeniable proof of the mechanism of the forgery. I thought about the hospital room. I remembered Valerie rummaging through her oversized leather tote bag, complaining about insurance paperwork. I visualized the heavy black self-inking notary stamp resting near her cosmetic compacts. A commercial loan and a forged trust amendment both require official state notarization to bypass institutional security protocols. The digital footprint was secured on my encrypted drive. Now I needed to hunt down the physical origin of the lie. I needed to trace that black stamp and identify the individual willing to risk their own state commission to facilitate her bank fraud. I closed the corporate registry tabs and opened the state licensing database, preparing to cross-reference her employee records with the municipal notary logs. The true investigation was about to begin, and I knew the slightest misstep would cause the entire trap to collapse. The impulse to pick up the phone and accuse my sister of federal crimes burned in the back of my throat. It is a primal human reflex to demand immediate answers when you unearth a betrayal of that scale. You want to hear their voice fracture. You want to listen to their frantic scrambling as they realize their fortress is made of glass. But I am an investigator. We are trained to suppress the emotional reflex. We understand that screaming an accusation is a tactical failure. If I confronted Valerie with the evidence of the leveraged timberland and the smurfed bank transfers, she would not offer a tearful confession. Cornered narcissists do not surrender. They mutate. If I alerted her to the breach, she would immediately recognize the vulnerability of her position. She would access the corporate accounts, transfer the remaining stolen equity into an untraceable offshore ledger, and physically destroy the original forged documents. She would then launch a preemptive strike against my credibility. She would contact the local authorities and our extended relatives, fabricating a story about a jealous sister attempting to hack her private business files. She would weaponize my anger, using it as proof of the mental instability she had been whispering about at the country club. The truth would become mired in a chaotic domestic dispute. I refused to grant her the friction she required to survive. The war had to move underground. I needed to let her believe her illusion remained impenetrable, while I quietly dismantled the foundational pillars of her theft. I spent the next 3 weeks operating in the digital shadows. My home office transformed into a forensic command center. The harsh Idaho winter battered the windows of my apartment, but the temperature inside my workspace felt clinical and precise. I utilized my professional clearance to access the restricted municipal networks. I pulled the state tax registries and the corporate formation documents for Vanguard Public Relations. I needed to map the exact trajectory of every single dollar she had washed through the boutique. The smurfing operation was a tedious, repetitive sequence of transactions designed to bore a casual observer into compliance. I do not get bored by numbers. I extracted the digital logs, isolating the structured drafts of $9,500. I tracked the capital as it flowed from the primary estate trust into the receiving accounts of her failing business. I documented the dates, the timestamps, and the authorization codes. I built a comprehensive spreadsheet that mirrored her financial desperation. The math painted a vivid portrait of a woman bleeding out, attempting to patch a severed artery with stolen Band-Aids. But digital routing logs, while compelling to a regulatory board, are not always enough to secure a swift criminal indictment. High-priced defense attorneys specialize in muddying digital waters. They argue technical glitches, unauthorized access, or delegated administrative errors. I needed a physical anchor. I required undeniable physical proof of the mechanism she used to execute the original forgery. My mind returned to the sterile recovery room at the rehabilitation clinic. I visualized Valerie rummaging through her oversized designer tote bag. I saw the heavy black, self-inking notary stamp resting near her expensive cosmetics. A legal amendment transferring the executive control of a multi-million-dollar timberland portfolio requires an independent witness. It demands the seal of a licensed state notary public who swears under penalty of perjury that they verified the identity and the cognitive capacity of the signatory. Arrogant people often view legal requirements as tedious hurdles meant only for the working class. They believe their inherent status allows them to bypass the rules. I suspected Valerie had taken a shortcut. I opened a new encrypted browser window and accessed the Idaho Secretary of State Official Notary Registry. I cross-referenced the business address of Vanguard Public Relations with the active and inactive municipal commission logs. The database processed the query, returning a localized list of certified individuals. I scanned the names, searching for a connection to my sister's boutique firm. A specific entry caught my attention. The name was Lauren Davis. I pulled the historical payroll records I had extracted from the corporate tax filings. Lauren Davis was listed as a former junior administrative assistant for Vanguard Public Relations. The puzzle pieces locked together with a chilling, satisfying precision. I dug deeper into the employment timeline. Lauren Davis had resigned from the boutique firm 8 months prior. I checked the status of her state notary commission on the registry. The digital text glowed stark and white against the dark interface. The commission had expired 2 years ago. The state had revoked her active status due to a failure to submit the required renewal documentation. The architecture of the forgery revealed itself in high definition. Valerie had not hired an independent legal contractor to visit the hospice facility. She had not secured a legitimate witness to verify our dying father's wishes. When her former assistant resigned, Valerie had simply kept the physical rubber stamp. She tossed it into her designer handbag, arrogantly assuming that a quick press of black ink on a piece of paper would wield the magic required to bypass the scrutiny of a federal bank. She treated a state commission seal like a prop in her theatrical production. It was a sloppy, catastrophic oversight. The arrogance of that decision was staggering. Utilizing an expired, unverified notary stamp to execute a trust amendment is not a minor clerical error. It is a systemic violation of a state law. The fraudulent document she used to seize control of the timberland, the very same document she used as collateral to secure the commercial bank loan, was legally void the exact moment the ink dried. She had handed me the instrument of her own destruction, bundled neatly in a careless assumption. I did not smile. I felt the cold, dense weight of the impending execution. I turned on the laser printer resting on the edge of my desk. I needed to translate the digital evidence into a physical weapon. The machine hummed to life, spitting out the warm pages of the forensic audit. I printed the metadata from the structured wire transfers, highlighting the exact smurfing patterns. I printed the collateral schedules from the commercial loan, proving she had committed federal bank fraud while our father was still alive. Finally, I printed the employment logs and the state registry pages, confirming the expiration of the notary seal. I requisitioned a heavy-duty 3-ring binder from my supply cabinet. I utilized colored tabs to organize the data, creating a clear, undeniable visual map of her treason. Red designated the fraudulent commercial loan. Blue marked the structured laundering transfers. Yellow highlighted the expired notary metadata and the forged signature. I slid each piece of paper into a clear plastic protective sleeve, snapping them into the metal rings. I was not compiling a simple report. I was building a forensic guillotine. Every page represented a calculated decision by my sister to prioritize her curated vanity over the legacy our father had spent his life building. Every tab was a nail in the coffin of her public relations empire. I closed the thick vinyl cover of the binder. The snap of the rings echoed in the quiet apartment. The paper trail was impenetrable. The evidence was absolute. I placed the binder inside my briefcase. I had locked the perimeter. I possessed the leverage required to dismantle her wealth, her social standing, and her freedom. But presenting this ledger to a standard civil judge would ignite a protracted legal battle. Valerie would use the stolen trust funds to hire an army of litigators to delay the proceedings. I needed to sever her access to the Capitol before she even realized the war had begun. I needed an institutional ally. I required someone situated deep inside the financial network, someone who possessed the executive authority to freeze the assets and the ethical rigidity to recognize a crime. I thought about the primary holding accounts for the Timberland portfolio. I thought about the Boise Financial Center, where the trust was legally housed. The institution was managed by a veteran banker who harbored a profound, well-documented intolerance for fiduciary deception. The time for gathering evidence in the shadows had concluded. It was time to initiate the silent pact. I picked up my phone and drafted an encrypted email requesting a highly confidential meeting with Mr. Caldwell. The trap was ready to be armed. The Boise Financial Center occupies a sleek tower of steel and tinted glass in the downtown district. I walked through the revolving doors at precisely 8 in the morning. The lobby hummed with quiet, expensive energy. Polished granite floors reflected the soft, ambient lighting. I bypassed the busy teller lines and approached the secure executive elevators. My leather briefcase hung heavy from my grip. It contained the forensic dossier I had spent 3 weeks assembling in the dark. Arthur Caldwell occupied a corner suite on the 12th floor. He was a veteran of the banking industry. He possessed the rigid posture of a military officer and the meticulous nature of a senior auditor. He viewed fiduciary duty not as a corporate buzzword, but as a sacred oath. He despised financial deception. He treated his institution like a sanctuary designed to protect the assets of those who entrusted their livelihoods to his care. Valerie had unknowingly desecrated his sanctuary. His secretary ushered me into the expansive office. The space smelled of lemon polish and aged paper. Caldwell sat behind a broad mahogany desk. He looked up from his monitor, offering a polite, professional nod. I did not sit in the leather guest chair and offer a tearful narrative about sibling rivalry. I did not ask for sympathy regarding my stolen inheritance. Emotional displays in a financial setting only dilute the authority of the data. You do not ask a banker to care about your broken heart. You ask a banker to care about their compromised security. I placed my briefcase on his desk. I opened the brass clasps. I extracted the thick, color-coded binder and slid it across the polished wood. Caldwell adjusted his reading glasses. He opened the vinyl cover. I guided him through the architecture of the theft. I started with the blue tabs. I showed him the metadata from the structured wire transfers. I explained the smurfing operation, detailing how Valerie had systematically drafted sums of $9,500 to evade his institution's automated reporting thresholds. I traced the routing numbers, proving the capital was flowing directly into the operating accounts of her failing public relations firm. Caldwell's expression remained neutral, but his breathing slowed. He was a man processing a systemic breach of his own security protocols. I turned the page to the red tabs. I presented the Uniform Commercial Code filings. I showed him the collateral schedules, proving Valerie had leveraged the Timberland Trust to secure a commercial loan months before my father died. She had utilized the assets housed within his bank to perpetrate federal fraud. Then I delivered the final, undeniable blow. I directed his attention to the yellow tabs. I presented the scanned copy of the trust amendment Valerie had submitted to his branch to seize control of the accounts. I pointed to the black notary seal. I laid the state registry records directly beside it, proving the commission belonging to her former employee had expired 2 years prior. Caldwell stared at the expired date. The air in the executive suite grew thin. He realized that a junior loan officer in his branch had accepted a fraudulent, voided document, granting a desperate woman access to a multi-million-dollar portfolio. He realized his bank had been utilized as a laundering mechanism for illicit activity. Caldwell closed the binder. He removed his glasses and placed them on the desk. He did not shout. He did not pound his fist against the mahogany. He exhibited the exact same chilling, lethal calm I utilized during my own investigations. The tightening of his jaw was the only physical manifestation of his fury. We spoke the same language. We both recognized that a severe infection had infiltrated the system and it required immediate surgical excision. We forged a silent pact in that corner office. I explained the tactical necessity of keeping the target blind. If Caldwell simply froze the accounts and issued a formal termination letter, Valerie would realize the perimeter was breached. She would panic. She would destroy the corresponding records at her boutique and launch a preemptive public relations campaign to frame the bank for a clerical error. She would move whatever residual liquid cash she possessed into untraceable offshore accounts. We could not afford to give her a clean exit. I proposed a different mechanism. I suggested we starve her. Caldwell nodded, understanding the psychological warfare of the strategy. He turned to his computer terminal. He initiated a federal mandate on the trust accounts, placing a hard, undeniable lock on the remaining capital. The vault was officially sealed. No funds could exit the registry. The Timberland equity was secured, but Caldwell possessed the administrative authority to alter the consumer interface. He programmed the outward-facing client portal to project an illusion. When Valerie logged in to check her balances, the system would not display a locked status or a fraud alert. It would display a simple, yellow, pending notification next to her requested transfers. It was a brilliant administrative torture. Valerie was currently facing a looming balloon payment for her commercial lease. She was desperate for immediate liquidity. She would log into the bank portal, expecting to see her stolen funds cleared for withdrawal. Instead, she would see a perpetual holding pattern. She would be forced to sit in the suffocating anxiety of a delayed transaction. Every hour the payment remained pending, her panic would compound. She would assume it was a minor bureaucratic delay. She would wait. She would refresh the screen. She would sweat over a phantom ledger, entirely unaware that the treasury was closed and the executioners were already reviewing her final statement. She would feel the walls of her own insolvency closing in, but she would lack the data to understand why the doors would not open. I thanked Mr. Caldwell for his discretion. I secured my briefcase and walked out of the financial center. The trap was armed. We were no longer simply disputing a will. We were organizing a forensic execution. Now we simply had to wait for the starvation to force her into making a fatal error in broad daylight. A predator deprived of resources becomes erratic. They abandon their careful maneuvers and take reckless risks to secure their survival. I knew Valerie could not endure the pending status for long. Her creditors were circling. The lease on her downtown office was expiring. The artificial wealth she paraded at the country club required a constant influx of cash to maintain. Without the trust fund, she was weeks away from public ruin. She would need to seek alternative solutions. She would need to bypass the digital portal and attempt to force the issue in person. She would assume her social status and her sheer demanding presence could override a banking glitch. But before she marched into the lobby to demand her money, she would likely try to secure her flank. She would want to ensure I was remaining silent and compliant in my dreary government cubicle. The ticking clock was winding down, and the pressure was about to push her directly into my workspace. The execution of a financial freeze requires strict administrative discipline. When you sever a target's access to capital, you do not want them to realize the vault is permanently locked. You want them to believe the door is merely stuck. Mr. Caldwell understood this psychological dynamic perfectly. The veteran branch manager programmed the outward-facing client portal to project an illusion of routine bureaucratic friction. When Valerie logged into the banking interface from her boutique public relations firm, she did not encounter a stark red fraud alert. She encountered a polite yellow status indicator. The system informed her that the transfer of the Timberland Trust funds was pending. To keep the ticking clock running without raising suspicion, Caldwell instructed the automated system to generate intermittent verification requests. Every 48 hours, a new email arrived in Valerie's inbox. The messages contained sterile corporate phrasing, asking for secondary identification documents or updated tax identification numbers for her business entity. It was a brilliant form of administrative torture. The delay starved her of the liquidity she desperately required. Valerie was operating on a collapsing timeline. The glossy downtown office space housing her public relations firm was governed by a structured commercial lease. The agreement featured a low introductory rate designed to attract tenants, followed by a substantial balloon payment at the 36-month mark. That specific month had arrived. If she failed to satisfy the balloon payment, the commercial landlord would initiate immediate eviction proceedings. The pristine, polished exterior of her life, the tailored suits and the leased European sedan, relied entirely on the perception of her success. If the local business community witnessed her firm being locked out of its own suite, the curated facade would shatter. Her affluent clients would abandon her, and her remaining creditors would descend like scavengers. She needed the stolen inheritance to cover the deficit. She was sweating over a phantom ledger, checking the pending status on her monitor every single hour, entirely ignorant of the fact that the treasury was sealed and the executioners were currently drafting her indictment. A predator deprived of resources becomes erratic. The suffocating anxiety of the delayed transfer eroded her careful social posturing. She needed to assert control over her environment to compensate for the terror of her impending insolvency. That desperate need for dominance pushed her directly into my sovereign territory. My workspace is located on the 4th floor of the State Regulatory Board building. It is a highly secure environment, smelling of ozone and fresh printer toner. The aesthetic is purely functional, featuring beige cubicle partitions, gray industrial carpeting, and the steady rhythmic hum of the central ventilation system. It is a place designed for parsing tax discrepancies and identifying corporate malfeasance. It was a Thursday afternoon. I sat at my ergonomic desk utilizing the dual monitors to finalize the federal affidavits. The digital footprint was secure, but presenting a case to the regulatory authorities requires a rigid physical format. I was compiling the final pages of the color-coded forensic binder. I had the printed uniform commercial code filings, the metadata logs detailing the structured offshore wire transfers, and the state registry printouts proving the Notary Commission had expired 2 years prior. The documents rested on my desk, a thick, dense accumulation of unarguable facts. I was reviewing the sworn declarations that would formally hand the evidence over to the federal authorities. The quiet equilibrium of the government floor fractured without warning. I heard the sharp, unmistakable cadence of a familiar voice echoing from the primary reception desk down the long corridor. "I demand to see her right now," Valerie instructed the receptionist. Her tone was imperious, carrying the haughty, demanding pitch she reserved for service workers and administrative staff. "I do not have time to sit in a waiting area." The sudden proximity of the threat triggered an immediate physiological spike. My pulse accelerated. The instinct to scramble to frantically hide the sensitive documents laid out across my desk surged upward. In the compliance sector, you learn to suppress the panic reflex. You rely on the muscle memory forged through years of high-stakes audits. I did not gasp. I did not rush. I executed a precise, practiced sequence of movements. My left hand snapped across the keyboard, executing the security shortcut to instantly lock the encrypted terminal. The glowing financial data vanished behind a blank, password-protected screen. My right hand reached for a thick stack of mundane departmental budget reports resting on my secondary tray. I lifted the boring bureaucratic files and slid them smoothly over the open forensic binder. I aligned the edges, hiding the colored tabs and the damning metadata beneath pages of routine municipal expenditures. The camouflage was established just seconds before the sound of her designer heels clicked onto the carpeted floor of my specific aisle. Valerie stepped into the opening of my workspace. She brought the scent of expensive floral perfume into the sterile municipal air. She wore a tailored silk blouse and carried a heavy leather designer handbag. She looked agitated, the tight, strained lines around her mouth betraying the internal pressure of her failing business. She did not wait for an invitation to enter. She stepped forward and dropped her heavy handbag directly onto my desk. The brass hardware of the purse clattered against the surface. The bag came to a rest squarely on top of the mundane budget reports. It sat mere millimeters above the exact printed ledgers detailing her federal bank fraud and the forged estate amendment. The dramatic irony was a tangible, heavy presence in the cubicle. The architect of a multi-million-dollar theft was resting her luxury accessory directly on top of her own impending federal indictment. "You are incredibly difficult to track down, Evelyn." Valerie sighed, crossing her arms over her chest. She surveyed my workspace with a look of profound theatrical pity. "Look at this place. The lighting is dreadful. I cannot fathom how you spend your days trapped in this dreary little box analyzing other people's boring tax returns." She was projecting her own internal terror by belittling my stability. She needed to feel superior because the foundation beneath her own feet was crumbling into dust. She needed to look at my beige walls and convince herself that her precarious, fraudulent wealth was still a better alternative. "I am comfortable here," I replied, my voice a flat, surgical baritone. "The environment serves its purpose perfectly. What brings you to the State Building, Valerie?" She uncrossed her arms and offered a bright, brittle smile. It was a performance designed to convince both of us that she still controlled the narrative. "I was just passing through downtown after a meeting with my wealth manager," she lied seamlessly. "I wanted to drop by and give you a courtesy update regarding Dad's estate." She leaned forward, resting her hand on the strap of her designer bag. "I am finalizing the trust payout this week. The bank is just processing the final authorizations and clearing a few tedious administrative hurdles. Once the capital settles, the transition will be complete." She delivered the fiction with the breathless confidence of a seasoned public relations executive. She expected me to react with bitter resentment. She wanted me to challenge her authority or demand a fraction of the funds. She needed the friction to validate her victory. I did not point out the flaw in her timeline. I did not mention Mr. Caldwell or the federal mandate locking the vault. I offered a serene, impenetrable nod. "That sounds very efficient, Valerie." I stated, projecting a smooth, effortless calm. "I am glad the logistics are wrapping up so quickly. It must be a relief to have the capital secured." The casual mention of secured capital caused a microscopic twitch near the corner of her eye. The polite, unbothered acceptance short-circuited her strategy. She had arrived seeking a skirmish to vent her anxiety and found a smooth, frictionless surface. She picked up her heavy handbag, lifting it off the hidden forensic binder. She smoothed the front of her silk blouse, the smug, proprietary glow returning to her features. "It is a profound relief," she agreed. "I will let you get back to your paperwork, Evelyn. Try not to let the gray walls absorb your entire personality." She turned on her heel and walked away. I sat perfectly still, listening to the rhythmic clicking of her shoes fade down the corridor until the heavy glass doors of the reception area sealed shut behind her. I reached forward and moved the stack of budget reports exposing the blue vinyl cover of the dossier. The near miss crystallized the urgency of the situation. Valerie was walking away confident, believing her illusion remained undetected. But her visit confirmed the timeline was rapidly accelerating. The bank's stall tactics were pushing her to the absolute brink. When the pending status did not clear by Friday morning, the suffocating anxiety would mutate into desperate action. She would realize the commercial lease balloon payment could not be satisfied through patience. She would require an alternative source of leverage to bridge the gap and save her boutique firm from public ruin. She was out of maneuvers and out of time. The polite condescension in the office was her final attempt at maintaining a civilized facade. I knew her next move would discard the velvet glove entirely. The pressure was mounting, and she was about to orchestrate a direct, physical confrontation to extract my compliance using the only remaining asset she believed she possessed. Financial starvation operates on a strict, unyielding timeline. When you sever a target's access to capital, you do not need to initiate a confrontation. You simply allow the architecture of their own debt to crush them. The automated verification requests generated by Mr. Caldwell's system were functioning flawlessly. Every 48 hours, the bank portal dispatched a sterile corporate email to Valerie's boutique public relations firm. The messages cited routine compliance checks and requested updated tax identification numbers holding the multi-million-dollar trust payout in a perpetual pending status. Valerie was trapped in a digital purgatory. She was logging into the interface multiple times a day, expecting to see the stolen Timberland equity cleared for withdrawal. Instead, she encountered the same polite yellow notification. The delay was choking her enterprise. A boutique firm drowning in toxic liabilities cannot survive on pending transfers. The balloon payment on her premium downtown office lease was imminent. Her vendors were undoubtedly threatening to halt their services. The affluent illusion she paraded at the country club was fracturing under the strain of her actual insolvency. When a predator realizes their primary food source is locked away, they abandon their calculated social strategies. They discard the whisper campaigns and the subtle manipulations. Desperation breeds crude, unrefined action. She needed an immediate cash infusion to save her business and preserve her status. Since the bank refused to release the funds, she deduced that the administrative friction was merely a bureaucratic hurdle she could bypass by securing my total legal surrender. The Friday evening air in Boise carried a bitter, freezing edge. The sky was the color of bruised iron, signaling an incoming winter storm. I finished my shift at the State Regulatory Board, compiling the final federal affidavits for the wire fraud case. The paper trail was pristine. The evidence of her expired notary stamp and her leveraged commercial loan sat secured in the forensic binder. I left the government building and navigated my practical sedan through the dense evening traffic. I pulled into the surface lot of my modest apartment complex. The environment was quiet, functional, and devoid of luxury. It was the exact type of living arrangement Valerie routinely mocked. As my headlights swept across the asphalt, I noticed a severe disruption to the usual orderly parking grid. A sleek, imported European utility vehicle sat idling across two designated parking spaces. The engine emitted a low, powerful rumble, and thick white exhaust plumed into the freezing night air. I recognized the vehicle immediately. It was the least symbol of Valerie's curated success. I turned off my ignition and gathered my briefcase. I did not feel a spike of panic. I felt the cold, clinical anticipation of an auditor walking into a hostile exit interview. I stepped out of my car and the heavy driver's side door of the luxury vehicle swung open. Valerie stepped onto the cold pavement. The polished, untouchable aura she possessed during the memorial luncheon had evaporated entirely. The tailored linen suit she wore looked rumpled, the fabric pulling awkwardly across her shoulders. Her posture lacked its usual crisp, commanding cadence. She looked frayed at the edges, her movements sharp and erratic. The internal pressure of her failing business was bleeding through her flawless exterior. She did not wait for me to reach the sidewalk. She marched across the asphalt, closing the distance between us with a frantic, desperate energy. She bypassed the standard social pleasantries, dropping the polite, concerned sister facade she utilized in front of her country club audience. She stopped 3 feet away from me. She reached into her designer handbag and extracted a thick, stapled legal document. She thrust the paper directly toward my chest, forcing me to raise my hand and accept the parcel to prevent it from striking me. "We are settling this tonight," Evelyn Valerie stated. Her voice was harsh, vibrating with a toxic, suppressed panic. "I am done playing these passive-aggressive games with you. I am done watching you pout in your dreary little apartment while I manage the heavy lifting for this family." I looked down at the stapled pages. The document was a formal settlement contract. It was drafted with dense, aggressive legal typography designed to intimidate the reader into quick compliance. I did not react to her insulting tone. I held my briefcase in one hand and the contract in the other, maintaining a relaxed, open stance. I asked her what she was attempting to settle. Valerie crossed her arms over her chest, a defensive posture meant to project strength. She offered a tight, brittle smile that failed to conceal the terror in her eyes. "I am offering you a way out, Evelyn," she declared, her pitch rising slightly. "I know you are struggling on your civil servant wages. I know the estate transition has been difficult for you to process." She gestured toward the contract resting in my hand. "I am offering you a generous sisterly allowance," Valerie continued. $50,000 in liquid cash transferred directly into your personal account by Monday morning. Furthermore, I am signing the deed to the family home over to you entirely. The offer hung in the freezing air. $50,000 and a piece of real estate. To a standard civil servant carrying student loans, it would represent a life-altering windfall. She framed the extortion as a charitable gift, overflowing from the goodness of her heart. She was attempting to purchase the high ground, pretending she was dispensing benevolence to a destitute relative. But I am a fraud investigator. I do not read the top-line offer. I read the liability clauses hidden in the fine print. I lifted the document and turned to the second page. I bypassed the payment schedules and located the release of claims section. The text was unambiguous. It was a comprehensive liability waiver. By accepting the funds and the property deed, the signatory officially forfeited any right to contest the recent trust amendments. More importantly, the clause explicitly barred the recipient from ever initiating, participating in, or assisting with any financial audit regarding the estate assets. The trap was laid bare on the asphalt. Valerie was not offering a gift. She was attempting to purchase lifelong immunity. She needed my signature on that waiver to present to Mr. Caldwell. She believed that if she provided the bank manager with a legally binding document proving I had surrendered all claims to the trust, the institution would lift the pending status and release the capital she desperately required to save her public relations firm. The dramatic irony was a tangible, heavy presence in the parking lot. It was so profound, it bordered on the absurd. Valerie stood shivering in the Idaho winter, attempting to bribe a state regulatory investigator using stolen money she could no longer access. She was writing a check from a locked vault. She was offering me a fraction of my own stolen inheritance to purchase my silence regarding a federal bank fraud that was already documented, printed, and sitting inside the briefcase resting against my leg. She believed she was executing a masterful corporate maneuver. She was entirely ignorant of the fact that the federal mandate freezing her accounts was not a minor bureaucratic delay, but the first stage of her criminal indictment. "If you refuse this offer, I will rescind the capital," Valerie threatened, misinterpreting my silence as hesitation. I will sue you for harassment. I will drag your government career into a public scandal and ensure you spend the next 5 years drowning in legal fees. Take the money, Evelyn, sign the paper, and walk away. I did not point out her impending ruin. I did not mention the offshore wire transfers, the structured smurfing operation, or the expired notary stamp. Warning a predator that the cage is locked only gives them time to chew through the bars. I absorbed the extortion in silence, letting her document her own cruelty. I allowed her to stand in the cold and expose the sheer depth of her desperation. I folded the settlement contract in half. I did not require a pen. I extended my arm and handed the unsigned document back to her. My signature is not for sale. Valerie, I stated. My voice was a flat, surgical baritone, carrying the cold density of iron. She stared at the folded paper in her hand. The confident, demanding matriarch vanished, leaving behind a cornered, frantic debtor. She realized the bribery had failed. She realized the intimidation had yielded zero friction. She was out of leverage and out of time. She spun around on her heel, her tailored suit shifting awkwardly. She marched back to her idling luxury vehicle. She pulled the heavy door open and climbed inside, slamming it shut with a violent, echoing crash. The engine roared as she accelerated, reversing out of the parking spaces with reckless velocity. The tires squealed against the cold asphalt as she sped out of the apartment complex, fleeing the scene of her failed ambush. I stood in the quiet lot and watched the red taillights disappear down the street. Valerie was driving away, convinced that my stubbornness was the only obstacle remaining between her and her stolen fortune. She believed her sister was simply too bitter to accept a rational buyout. Ignorant of the true nature of the financial freeze, she would inevitably conclude that the problem required a direct, forceful escalation at the source. If she could not bully me into signing a waiver, she would attempt to bully the bank manager into releasing the funds without one. She was out of maneuvers, and her balloon payment was due. I knew her next step would be a march directly into the Boise Financial Center, where the final stage of the forensic execution was waiting for her. The Boise Financial Center is an imposing structure of steel glass and polished stone, located in the heart of the downtown commercial district. It is an environment engineered to project institutional permanence and unyielding security. The architecture itself is designed to make the visitor feel small while reassuring them that their assets are protected by an impenetrable fortress. I arrived at the facility 45 minutes before the commercial lending floor officially opened to the general public. I did not occupy a seat in the standard civilian waiting area near the teller lines. I bypassed the casual seating and took my place in a high-backed leather chair situated directly outside Mr. Caldwell's glass-walled executive suite. My posture was perfectly aligned, my spine pressed flat against the rich, dark upholstery. A thick manila folder rested squarely on my lap. It contained the culmination of my 14-month underground investigation. Inside that unassuming cardboard jacket were the printed records of the structured smurfing operation, the offshore routing nodes, the leveraged commercial loan documents, and the undeniable proof of the expired notary stamp. It was a forensic guillotine, systematically categorized by colored plastic tabs and waiting for the executioner to drop the blade. I did not fidget. I did not tap my foot against the immaculate marble floor or check the time on my phone. In the regulatory compliance sector, you learn to conserve your psychological energy before a hostile confrontation. You do not pace the corridor. You do not review the documentation for 100th time. You trust the mathematics you have compiled. You let the verified data anchor you to the earth. The timeline had officially converged. The 14 months of deniable slights, the whispered insults at the country club memorial luncheon, the forged trust amendment, and the desperate extortion attempt in my apartment parking lot were all funneling into this exact Tuesday morning. The administrative stall tactics deployed by the bank had performed their function flawlessly. Valerie had spent the last several days logging into the consumer banking portal, sweating over a digital ledger that perpetually displayed a polite, yellow, pending notification. She was starved of capital. Her boutique public relations firm was suffocating under the weight of an impending commercial lease balloon payment. Her creditors were undoubtedly circling her downtown office, threatening to shatter the pristine, affluent illusion she had curated for her elite social circle. She could no longer afford to wait for the bureaucratic friction to resolve itself. Severe financial desperation demands physical action. She needed to assert her dominance, bypass the digital blockade, and bully a branch manager into releasing the stolen timberland equity. At precisely 9 o'clock, the polite electronic chime of the bank double doors echoed through the hushed, air-conditioned lobby. I shifted my gaze toward the entrance without moving my head. Valerie strode across the threshold. She wore a tailored linen suit, the pale fabric catching the recessed halogen lighting of the financial center. She carried her heavy designer handbag like a shield of status, projecting the unearned authority of a woman who believed she commanded the entire facility by divine right. But a trained corporate auditor observes the subtle discrepancies beneath the polished exterior. Her cadence was too rapid. The sharp, aggressive clicking of her designer heels against the marble floor betrayed a frantic, vibrating panic thrumming just beneath her skin. Her jaw was clenched tight, and the knuckles gripping the leather strap of her purse were white with unreleased tension. She was a drowning woman pretending she knew how to walk on water. She marched past the standard teller lines, ignoring the velvet ropes and the brass stanchions designed to govern the flow of civilian traffic. She possessed the supreme entitlement of a perceived multimillionaire. She headed straight for the commercial lending desks, intending to march directly into the manager's office and demand immediate access to her stolen treasury. She navigated around a large marble structural pillar, and her eyes swept across the executive waiting area. She spotted me. I watched the psychological sequence unfold across her features in real time. Her calculated, aggressive stride faltered for a microscopic fraction of a second. The steady rhythm of her heels stuttered against the stone. Encountering an unexpected variable in a high-stakes environment triggers an immediate threat response in the human nervous system. For a fleeting moment, a flash of profound confusion and genuine alarm flared in her eyes. She did not expect to find her sister, the dreary government civil servant, sitting outside the office of the senior bank manager, holding the keys to the estate. But narcissism is a powerful, distorting cognitive filter. It cannot process a scenario where it is not the dominant force. It aggressively overrides caution to preserve the fragile ego. The alarm in her eyes vanished, replaced instantly by a sharp, victorious smirk. The internal calculus she performed was obvious. She synthesized my presence through the lens of her own arrogance. She recalled our encounter in my apartment parking lot just days prior. She remembered shoving the settlement contract at my chest, offering a fraction of my own inheritance, and threatening to ruin my career and my reputation if I did not waive my legal rights to the trust. She assumed the extortion had succeeded. She deduced that the threat of endless litigation, homelessness, and public scandal had finally broken my resolve. In her curated reality, I was not sitting in that leather chair as a state investigator holding a federal indictment. I was sitting there as a defeated, impoverished relative waiting to beg for a crumb of the timberland equity. She believed I had come to the bank to formally surrender. The prospect of a total public capitulation was too intoxicating for her to ignore. A narcissist requires an audience to validate their fiction, and the busy bank lobby provided the perfect stage. Valerie altered her trajectory. She abandoned her direct path toward the glass-walled office and pivoted, walking deliberately toward my isolated chair. As she approached, the atmospheric pressure in the lobby began to drop. The tellers working behind the reinforced security glass paused their sorting. A senior loan officer at the adjacent desk stopped typing on his keyboard, his hands hovering over the keys. A security guard stationed near the entrance shifted his stance, sensing the sudden sharp elevation in the room's tension. The low murmur of transactional conversations faded into a heavy, expectant silence. When a predator prepares to strike, the surrounding ecosystem naturally holds its breath. Valerie stopped 2 feet away from my knees. She utilized her physical height to loom over me, casting a shadow across the manila folder resting on my lap. She did not offer a polite morning greeting. She did not ask why I was occupying the executive suite waiting area. She simply prepared to deliver her final, triumphant monologue. She was stepping into the spotlight, ready to execute a public demotion that would cement her status as the wealthy, victorious matriarch and banish me permanently to the working-class margins. She drew a breath, her lips curling into a smile that did not reach her cold, desperate eyes. The trap she had spent 14 months building was fully constructed. The audience of bank employees and affluent clients was present and watching. She believed she was about to deliver the killing blow. She was entirely ignorant of the fact that the floorboards had already been removed. The federal authorities were waiting in the wings, and the manila folder resting under my folded hands contained the exact coordinates of her ruin. Valerie halted exactly 24 inches from the edge of my leather chair. She utilized her physical proximity as a mechanism of intimidation, attempting to cast a long, imposing shadow over the thick manila folder resting on my lap. The scent of her expensive floral perfume washed over my airspace, a heavy, cloying fragrance, attempting to mask the sharp, sterile scent of the financial institution. She stood there, a curated portrait of affluent entitlement, wearing her tailored linen suit like armor. She angled her body to ensure the maximum number of bank employees possessed a clear line of sight to our interaction. She required witnesses for her victory lap. "Leaving you out of the trust was the best decision Dad ever made," Valerie announced. She pitched her voice to carry across the polished marble floor, ensuring the resonant acoustics of the lobby amplified her cruelty. The tellers working behind the reinforced security glass paused their sorting. A senior loan officer seated at an adjacent mahogany desk stopped typing on his keyboard. The ambient murmur of transactional conversations faded into a heavy, expectant quiet. The ecosystem of the bank recognized a predator in the room and instinctively held its breath. "Taking control of the estate saved it from your mediocrity," Valerie continued, her tone dripping with toxic manufactured pity. "You never had the stomach for real business. You have always been too timid to make the hard choices required to sustain a legacy." She stood under the recessed halogen lighting and delivered her perjury with breathtaking confidence. The dramatic irony suspended in the chilled air of the lobby was thick enough to carve with a scalpel. I looked at the woman pontificating about legacy and real business. I evaluated her claims against the verified time-stamped data secured inside the folder resting beneath my folded hands. Valerie was standing in a federal bank boasting about her immaculate business acumen, entirely ignorant of the fact that her public relations enterprise was functionally insolvent. She was lecturing me on the rigors of corporate stewardship while secretly defaulting on her premium downtown commercial lease. She accused me of mediocrity, yet she was the architect of a structured laundering mechanism utilizing sophisticated smurfing techniques to siphon capital drop by drop just to keep her own creditors at bay. The most profound layer of irony resided in her claim regarding our father's trust. She praised his supposed final decision, knowing full well she had orchestrated a hostile takeover using a forged signature while he lay dying under heavy sedation. She had utilized an expired state notary stamp to bypass institutional security protocols, rendering her foundational document legally void the moment the ink dried. She had leveraged the stolen Timberland portfolio to secure a commercial loan before his heart even stopped beating, committing federal bank fraud to fund her vanity. She was a hollow, decaying shell boasting about her structural integrity. She was the textbook definition of root rot, standing in the center of a financial sanctuary, unaware that the arborists had already arrived with the chainsaws. Valerie finished her monologue and shifted her weight to her right foot, planting her designer heel against the marble. She waited for the impact of her words to register. She expected the carefully constructed facade of my composure to shatter. She anticipated a frantic, tearful defense of my intellect. She wanted me to raise my voice to argue about our father's true wishes and to demand my rightful share of the estate in front of the gathered audience. If I raised my pitch, I would validate her narrative. I would provide the chaotic, unstable reaction she needed to prove I was the bitter, erratic sister she had described to her affluent friends at the country club. If I caused a public scene, the bank's security personnel would escort me off the premises, cementing her dominance and clearing the path for her to march into the branch manager's office to demand the release of the pending funds. She needed my friction to sustain her momentum. I refused to supply the fuel. I did not grip the edges of my chair. I did not let my respiratory rate accelerate. In the compliance sector, when a corrupt executive attempts to intimidate an auditor during an ongoing investigation, you do not meet their energy. You remove the oxygen from the room. You become a mirror reflecting their desperate noise with unbroken clinical stillness. I looked at her tailored linen suit. I looked at the tight, strained lines bracketing her mouth and the frantic, gleaming panic hidden just behind her eyes. I offered her a serene, impenetrable smile. It was a warm, bright expression that carried zero defensive heat. "Is that what you believe, Valerie?" I asked. My voice was a flat, surgical baritone. It did not echo through the lobby. It did not invite debate. It was a simple, administrative confirmation of her statement, delivered with the frictionless cadence of a woman who already possesses the verified ledger. I did not defend my capacity for corporate strategy. I did not mention the dual monitors in my dreary government cubicle or the hours I spent tracing her offshore routing nodes. I let the 5 words drop into the silent lobby, and I allowed the quiet to resume its heavy work. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3 seconds passed. The silence transformed from a passive state into an active, radiating force. Without my anger to act as a buffer, Valerie was forced to stand in the spotlight and absorb the echo of her own cruelty. The audience of bank employees and affluent clients watched her, waiting for the expected reciprocal drama that never materialized. 4 seconds. 5 seconds. 6. The comfortable, smug superiority began to slide off her face. The lack of resistance disrupted her internal script. She had prepared for a battle and encountered a void. She narrowed her eyes, searching my features for a crack in the armor, searching for a trembling lip or a tear. She found only a cold, unyielding wall of observation. 7 seconds. 8. The suffocating anxiety of her impending financial default crept back into her posture. The realization that her public execution had failed to produce a casualty unnerved her. She opened her mouth to issue another insult, needing to fill the terrifying quiet with more noise, needing to regain control of the frequency of the room. She never formed the syllable. Right as her smirk faltered and the desperate reality of her situation began to bleed through her polished exterior, the atmospheric pressure in the lobby shifted. The heavy frosted glass door of the executive suite, situated directly behind my chair, clicked open. The sharp mechanical sound severed the tension, drawing the collective attention of the room toward the corridor. Mr. Caldwell stepped out of his office. He did not carry the accommodating, eager posture of a branch manager preparing to apologize to a high-net-worth client for a minor bureaucratic delay. He walked with the rigid, measured steps of an institutional authority preparing to neutralize a severe security breach. The final stage of the forensic operation had commenced, and the trap was ready to snap shut around the woman in the linen suit. The 9 seconds of silence following my question hung suspended in the chilled air of the bank lobby. The quiet possessed a dense, radiating energy, forcing my sister to hold the weight of her own arrogant perjury under the bright fluorescent lights. She opened her mouth, her jaw tightening, as she searched for a response that could restore her curated dominance. She never formed the syllable. Right as the smug superiority began to slide off her face, the atmospheric pressure in the lobby underwent a fundamental shift. The heavy, frosted glass door of the executive suite, situated directly behind my chair, clicked open. The sound of the latch disengaging was a sharp, metallic snap that severed the tension in the room. Mr. Caldwell stepped out onto the polished marble floor. He did not emerge with the hurried, anxious steps of a middle manager desperate to placate a high-net-worth client. He walked with the heavy, measured cadence of an executive arriving to excise a terminal liability from his corporate ledger. He wore a dark worsted wool suit that seemed to absorb the ambient light. His expression was a portrait of unyielding, institutional authority. He did not look like a man preparing to apologize for a bureaucratic delay, Mrs. Vance Caldwell stated. His voice did not echo through the cavernous space, but it possessed a resonant quality that demanded immediate compliance. He did not phrase his next sentence as a polite request. "Please step into my office. We need to correct a severe administrative discrepancy." In the regulatory compliance sector, the word discrepancy is a surgical tool. It strips away the emotional theater of a conflict and reduces the interaction to a matter of verifiable data. To a trained fraud investigator, a severe discrepancy indicates a fatal structural flaw. It means the numbers have failed to align and a severe penalty is imminent. But narcissism functions as a profound cognitive distortion filter. It aggressively overrides caution to preserve the fragile ego. Valerie did not hear a warning. She heard an apology. I watched the tension drain from her shoulders. The frantic, gleaming panic that had pooled behind her eyes just moments prior evaporated. Her mind, desperate for a lifeline to save her failing public relations boutique, seized upon the word administrative and twisted it to fit her fabricated narrative. In her curated reality, the bank had finally located the minor clerical error that had been holding her stolen timberland equity in a perpetual pending status. She assumed Caldwell was stepping out to offer his personal regrets for the inconvenience and to hand her the authorization codes to the vault. She believed her commercial lease balloon payment was about to be satisfied. The victorious smirk returned to her lips, sharper and more arrogant than before. She turned her head and shot me a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. It was the gaze of a woman who believed she had just won a grueling war of attrition. She thought she had outlasted my silent scrutiny and bullied the financial institution into submission. She adjusted the strap of her designer handbag, lifting her chin, to project the aura of a reigning matriarch, and pivoted toward the executive suite. She marched across the short distance separating us from the glass-walled office. Her designer heels clicked against the polished stone in a rapid, self-satisfied rhythm. She was stepping into the spotlight, eager to collect her unearned prize. I did not sigh. I did not betray a single hint of the profound, dramatic irony humming in my chest. I placed my hands on the armrests of the leather chair and pushed myself upright. I smoothed the fabric of my charcoal skirt, ensuring my appearance remained as immaculate and unbothered as my internal state. I gripped the thick manila folder holding the color-coded forensic audit. The cardboard felt substantial in my hands, a physical anchor of undeniable truth, holding the metadata, the offshore routing nodes, and the proof of federal bank fraud. I walked directly behind my sister. I matched her path, but not her erratic energy. My steps were silent, measured, and inevitable. I was the shadow she had spent 14 months trying to outrun, finally catching up to her under the bright lights of the financial center. Mallory crossed the threshold of the manager's office. I stepped in right behind her. The heavy frosted glass door swung inward on its pneumatic hinges and clicked shut. The ceiling of the door severed the ambient noise of the teller lines and the lobby chatter. The acoustic isolation was immediate and profound. We were no longer in a public arena. We were standing inside a secure, soundproof container designed for executing high-level corporate maneuvers. Caldwell's office smelled of lemon polish, aged paper, and cold leather. An expansive mahogany desk dominated the center of the room, flanked by two heavy guest chairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Boise skyline, but the gray, overcast sky outside offered no warmth. It was a sterile, unforgiving environment. Mallory walked toward the desk, expecting to be offered a seat and a portfolio of cleared transfer documents. She was preparing to accept her coronation. It was only when she reached the edge of the mahogany that she registered the sound of a second person breathing in the room. She spun around on her heel. The silk fabric of her tailored linen suit rustled sharply in the quiet space. Her eyes locked onto me, standing just inside the closed door, holding the manila folder against my side. The smug, proprietary glow vanished from her features in a fraction of a second. It was replaced by a flash of raw, unfiltered indignation. She could not fathom why the dreary government civil servant she had just publicly demoted in the lobby was intruding on her moment of triumph. She viewed my physical presence in the executive suite as a contamination of her elite sphere. The delusion of her own superiority was so deeply ingrained that she still believed she dictated the guest list. "Excuse me," Valerie hissed. Her voice dropped to a venomous, hushed register, thick with manufactured outrage. She turned her glare away from me and directed it at the veteran bank manager standing behind his desk. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger in my direction. "This is a private financial meeting. I did not authorize her attendance." She spoke to Caldwell not as a respected institutional guardian, but as an insubordinate employee who had failed to manage a velvet rope. She attempted to leverage the stolen timberland wealth she believed she possessed to dictate the terms of the environment. "Have her removed immediately," Valerie commanded. Caldwell did not blink. He did not reach for his telephone to summon building security. He did not offer a polite, customer service-oriented apology for the intrusion. He exhibited the exact same chilling, lethal calm I utilize when interrogating a corrupt executive during a state regulatory audit. He moved with slow, deliberate precision. He rounded the edge of his expansive desk and took his seat in the high-backed leather executive chair. He placed his hands flat on the polished wood, his posture radiating a dense, unyielding authority. He looked at the frantic woman standing in front of him, assessing her with the cold detachment of a man evaluating a forged signature on a counterfeit ledger. He raised his right hand and gestured toward the empty leather guest chair positioned to Valerie's left. "Ms. Hamilton stays," Caldwell replied. The utilization of my formal surname was a calculated surgical strike. He did not refer to me as her sister. He did not frame my presence as a familial courtesy or a domestic tag-along. He addressed me by my professional title, establishing a rigid institutional boundary that Valerie could not cross. His tone carried the heavy, undeniable weight of iron. It offered zero room for negotiation. "She is essential to this proceeding," Caldwell finished. The 5 words hung in the sterile, chilled air of the executive suite. Valerie stood frozen on the plush carpet. The cognitive dissonance paralyzed her motor functions. She stared at Caldwell, her mind frantically trying to reconcile the contradictory data points. A bank manager preparing to release a multi-million-dollar trust payout does not invite an estranged sibling to witness the transaction. An accommodating financial officer does not deny a high-net-worth client a simple request for privacy. The suffocating anxiety she had been battling all week returned with blinding velocity. The terror of her impending commercial lease default and the crushing pressure of her insolvent public relations firm rushed back into her veins. The root rot was finally breaking the surface. She looked at the manila folder resting in my hands. The false narrative she had curated at the country club, the forged amendment she had submitted, the expired notary stamp she had used to bypass protocol, the entire fragile architecture of her treason began to creak under the sudden localized shift in gravity. She was trapped in a sealed room with the 2 people who possessed the exact coordinates of her ruin, and the time for deniable slights had officially expired. Mallory did not gracefully take her seat. Her knees simply ceased to function. The structural integrity of her posture dissolved, causing her to sink into the heavy leather guest chair like a hollow structure collapsing inward. The tailored linen suit she wore bunched awkwardly around her waist, the pristine fabric suddenly looking wrinkled and inadequate. The vibrant, triumphant color drained from her face in a rapid descending wash, leaving her skin a sickly ashen gray. She stared at the bank manager, her mind frantically trying to process the sudden severe shift in institutional authority. She had walked into the executive suite expecting a coronation. She found a tribunal. I did not raise my voice to claim the space. When you possess the verified ledger volume is a redundant, inefficient tool. I stepped forward, closing the short distance between my position near the frosted glass door and the edge of the expansive mahogany desk. I carried the thick manila folder holding the color-coded forensic audit. I removed the heavy binder from the cardboard enclosure, the plastic covers catching the ambient light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I extended my arms and placed the binder flat against the polished wood. I rested my fingertips against the spine and executed a firm, measured push. The binder glided across the smooth mahogany, a dense accumulation of unarguable facts, traveling the length of the desk until it stopped perfectly square in front of my sister's hands. "The trust accounts are frozen, Valerie," I stated. My voice carried the cold, unyielding density of iron. It offered zero defensive friction and no room for negotiation. It was a simple administrative confirmation of her insolvency. Valerie stared at the blue vinyl cover, her breath hitched, producing a shallow, ragged sound. She looked at the colored plastic tabs protruding from the edges of the pages, recognizing the visual language of a systematic investigation. She had spent 14 months weaving a fragile fiction of wealth and competence, whispering to country club wives about her immaculate business acumen while mocking my dreary government cubicle. She was now forced to look at the exact product of that cubicle. "You believed the pending notification on your digital portal was a routine administrative delay." I continued, my tone remaining surgical and detached. "You assumed Mr. Caldwell was simply clearing bureaucratic hurdles before releasing the timberland equity to your public relations firm. You were incorrect." I reached across the desk and flipped the heavy cover open. I bypassed the summary pages and navigated directly to the section marked with blue tabs. I wanted her to see the architecture of her own treason. The pending status was a federal mandate designed to starve your operation of capital while we finalized the documentation of your wire fraud, I explained. We traced the structured transfers you routed to bypass the reporting thresholds. We watched you initiate a series of precise, calculated drafts, each one for exactly $9,500. Valerie gasped. The sound was a sharp, involuntary intake of oxygen. She stared at the metadata logs printed in stark black ink. She saw the routing nodes, the time-stamped authorizations, and the geographical coordinates. "You attempted to utilize a decentralized exchange platform to wash the stolen equity," I said, detailing the mechanics of her crime to ensure she understood the depth of the breach. "You funneled the capital directly into the operating accounts of Vanguard Public Relations. Your boutique firm is drowning in toxic debt. Your premium downtown commercial lease is in default. You are functionally bankrupt, and you attempted to patch your severed financial arteries using our father's legacy." Her manicured hands began to tremble. The severe tremor traveled up her wrists, vibrating against the cuffs of her linen suit. She looked at Mr. Caldwell, her eyes wide, with a frantic, desperate plea for intervention. But she found only the cold, unblinking assessment of a veteran banker guarding his sanctuary. I turned the page, flipping to the section marked with red tabs. "The smurfing operation was merely a symptom of your desperation," I told her. "The true betrayal occurred long before the structured transfers began." I presented the Uniform Commercial Code filings and the secondary lending documents. I pointed to the specific dates stamped across the top margins. "We know you used the Timberland Trust as collateral to secure a commercial loan before Dad passed away," I stated. The words hovered in the chilled air of the executive suite, dense and inescapable. "You did not wait for him to succumb to his illness. You utilized his assets while he was still undergoing rehabilitation, trusting you to manage his schedule. You forged his authorization and submitted the portfolio to a commercial lender to secure a bailout for your failing vanity project." Valerie pressed her spine hard against the back of the leather chair. She was suffocating under the weight of her own documented perjury. She opened her mouth to formulate a denial, perhaps to spin a frantic tale of mistaken identity or unauthorized accounting errors, but her vocal cords refused to cooperate. She was cornered by bulletproof paper, and the final, fatal blow was still waiting to be delivered. I turned to the final section of the binder highlighted by the yellow tabs. I presented the scanned copy of the trust amendment she had submitted to the bank. the document that allegedly revoked all prior stipulations and granted her sole dominion over the estate. And I added, dropping the final, undeniable fact onto the mahogany desk. We located the physical origin of the lie. I tapped my index finger against the circular black seal pressed into the bottom corner of the page. You assumed legal compliance was a tedious hurdle meant only for the working class. You believed a quick, unauthorized stamp would bypass the need to bring our dying father to a certified professional. I laid the state registry records directly beside the forged amendment. We pulled the municipal logs for Lauren Davis, your former administrative assistant, I explained. You kept her physical notary stamp in your desk drawer long after she resigned. You utilized her seal to validate your hostile takeover. But you failed to verify the active status of her commission. Valerie stared at the state registry printout, her eyes locked onto the bold text detailing the expiration date. The stamp you used expired 2 years prior. I stated, bringing the forensic execution to its logical conclusion. The document you hold is legally void. It was void the exact moment the ink dried on the parchment. You handed us the instrument of your own destruction, bundled neatly in a careless, arrogant assumption. The silence that followed was profound. It was the heavy, unbroken quiet of a definitive checkmate. I stepped back from the desk, yielding the floor to the institutional authority sitting behind the mahogany. Mr. Caldwell folded his hands, resting them over his pristine blotter. He looked at the ruined executive sitting in his guest chair. Your accounts are under federal review for bank fraud and tax evasion, Mrs. Vance Caldwell announced. His voice projected the uncompromising permanence of a steel vault locking shut. The forged amendment you submitted to this branch has been formally flagged and remitted to the regulatory authorities. You possess exactly 0 jurisdiction over this estate. The 0 hung in the air, a mathematical absolute that erased her curated social standing, her leased luxury vehicles, and her entire fabricated identity. She was stripped of her leverage, stripped of her stolen wealth, and trapped in a room with the evidence of her impending incarceration. The polished corporate owner was dissolving rapidly, the root rot finally breaking through the surface, leaving her searching desperately for an escape route that did not exist. The realization of her total, inescapable ruin was setting in, and the polished facade was about to fracture into a spectacular, self-inflicted implosion. The revelation of the expired notary stamp and the federal bank fraud hung suspended in the chilled air of the executive suite. The polished corporate owner dissolved right in front of me. The tailored linen suit Valerie wore seemed to lose its structural integrity, bunching awkwardly around her shoulders as she sank deeper into the heavy leather guest chair. The vibrant, triumphant flush that had colored her cheeks during her lobby performance drained away in a rapid descending wash. Her skin assumed the sickly, pallid hue of old parchment. She stared at the thick forensic binder resting on the mahogany desk. Her mind, accustomed to spinning public relations fictions and managing aesthetic marketing campaigns, could not process the unyielding density of a verified audit. She had spent 14 months curating a flawless illusion of wealth, whispering to affluent country club wives about her immaculate business acumen, all while treating my career as a tedious joke. She was now forced to stare directly at the terminal product of my profession. She opened her mouth to issue a denial, perhaps to spin a frantic tale of mistaken identity or unauthorized accounting errors, but her vocal cords refused to cooperate. Instead of a commanding directive, she produced only a thin, reedy, pathetic sob. It was the sound of an imposter realizing the stage had been dismantled while she was still standing in the spotlight. She raised a trembling hand, pointing a manicured finger at the blue vinyl cover of the dossier. The crimson polish on her nails starkly contrasted with the severe tremor vibrating through her digits. "Evelyn, please," Valerie stammered, her voice a fragile, breathless rasp. She did not sound like a wealthy matriarch. She sounded like a cornered debtor pleading with a collection agent. "You cannot do this. We are family. You cannot hand this ledger to the authorities. It will ruin me. Think about Dad. Think about our legacy." The invocation of our father's legacy was a breathtaking display of narcissistic delusion. She had forged his signature while he lay dying under heavy sedation. She had leveraged his life's work to secure a toxic commercial loan, utilized an expired state seal to bypass institutional protocols, and treated his cherished timberland as a personal slush fund to cover her own insolvency. Now stripped of her false narrative and cornered by bulletproof paper, she attempted to use his memory as a human shield. She searched the room for a lifeline that did not exist. She looked at Mr. Caldwell, but the veteran branch manager simply folded his hands over his pristine blotter, guarding his financial sanctuary with cold, unblinking detachment. I did not raise my pitch. I did not offer a dramatic parting monologue about the pain of being the dismissed invisible sister. When the truth does the heavy lifting, adding emotional noise only cheapens the victory. I placed my hands on the armrests of my chair and pushed myself upright. The fabric of my charcoal skirt fell smoothly around my legs. I stood tall in the quiet office, my posture perfectly aligned. Family is not a liability waiver you invoke after committing federal bank fraud, Valerie, I stated. My voice was a flat, surgical baritone, carrying the cold density of iron. You evaluated the assets at your disposal and decided my inheritance was acceptable collateral damage to save your failing boutique. You built a trap and walked directly into it. I leaned closer, resting my fingertips against the edge of Caldwell's desk, delivering the final poetic justice she had earned. Because you utilized the state banking network to launder the stolen capital, I instructed her, ensuring every syllable landed with undeniable permanence. And because you attempted to mask the extraction through structured smurfing techniques, the case was automatically flagged for regulatory review. I watched her eyes widen, the realization of her total exposure settling into her bones. The irony was a heavy, tangible entity in the room. My specific State Department has already absorbed the file, I continued. We initiated the joint task force with the federal authorities yesterday afternoon. Your systemic tax evasion, your offshore routing nodes, and your corporate insolvency will be dismantled by the exact dreary government cubicle you spent the last year mocking. The civil servant she had pitied at the memorial luncheon was the lead investigator, holding the keys to her incarceration. Caldwell, having observed the execution with the quiet satisfaction of a banker neutralizing a threat to his institution, opened a secure drawer behind his desk. He extracted a slim, elegant folder and handed the parcel across the mahogany surface. It contained the original, valid trust documents. It was the authentic architecture of my father's estate, unpolluted by forged amendments or expired stamps. I took the folder. The paper felt substantial in my hands, a physical anchor of restored reality. I turned my back on the wreckage. I did not look at my sister again. I walked toward the frosted glass door, grasped the heavy brass handle, and pulled it open. I stepped out of the executive suite and back into the sprawling, polished marble lobby of the Boise Financial Center. The ambient hum of transactional conversations had returned to the floor, but the atmosphere near the entrance carried a sudden, sharp shift in gravity. The polite electronic chime of the bank double doors rang out a second time. I looked toward the vestibule. 3 men and 1 woman strode through the glass threshold. They did not wear the casual attire of retail banking customers. They wore dark, utilitarian suits and carried themselves with the rigid, unmistakable cadence of federal agents. Subtle enamel badges rested on their belts. The Joint Task Force had arrived. They moved with swift, coordinated precision, bypassing the velvet ropes and the teller lines. They were heading directly for the commercial lending desks. They were heading for the glass-walled office I had just vacated. Valerie possessed no avenue for escape. There would be no frantic flight to the parking lot, no desperate scramble to a regional airport. Her runway had officially ended. I walked past the advancing agents, our paths crossing in the center of the marble floor. We did not exchange words, but a silent, professional acknowledgement passed between us. The baton was officially handed over. I pushed through the revolving doors and stepped out into the crisp, biting air of the Idaho morning. The sky hung low over the distant mountains, but the suffocating weight that had pressed against my chest for 14 months was gone. The toxic debt, the whisper campaigns, the deniable slights, all of it remained trapped inside the steel and glass tower behind me, locked in a room with the authorities. The root rot had been identified, isolated, and permanently excised from the healthy timber. I walked toward my practical sedan, holding the true legacy of the trust securely under my arm. I left my sister to drown in the shallow, empty grave she had spent over a year digging for me. That is my story. A forged signature, an arrogant public relations executive, and a quiet auditor who refused to surrender the ledger. If you are currently sitting across a table from someone who treats your boundaries as an inconvenience or your silence as weakness, I hope this serves as a clinical reminder. You do not need to generate noise to command a room. You do not need to participate in their theatrical shouting matches. You simply need to keep your records pristine, trace the routing numbers, and wait for the precise moment to drop the receipts. The person with the cleanest paper trail wins the argument before it ever begins. Protect your perimeter and never let them write your ending. Thank you for listening. Drop a comment below if you have ever executed a quiet checkmate in your own life. Hit that subscribe button, and I will see you in the next episode of Pana Vengeance.